stepped into the house, still smelling of the sea breeze and hibiscus-scented lotion. Her tan was fresh, her suitcase still sand-dusted, and her smile, real. The honeymoon in Santorini had been exactly what she needed after months of wedding planning chaos. She was ready to come home, take off her shoes, and finally just exist as Claire Morgan, newlywed, relaxed, and completely in love with her husband David. David unlocked the door first, pulling it open with the flourish of a man who still thought of himself as charming. "Home sweet home," he said, flashing a grin. Claire chuckled, following behind him with her suitcase in tow, ready to drop everything and collapse on the sofa. But the moment she stepped into the hallway, she paused. There were shoes by the door. Not hers, not David's. 3 pairs, all sensible, all beige. Claire blinked. Did we forget to cancel the cleaning service? David didn't answer. He was staring at the freshly painted wall at the end of the hallway that used to be a cool dove gray. Now it was pale yellow with a sun-themed mirror hanging awkwardly off-center. Claire's suitcase thudded against the floor as she moved forward. The living room was different. The throw pillows were replaced with satin ones. The bookshelf had been reorganized alphabetically, but in reverse. There was a faint smell of lavender potpourri, the kind Claire would never buy. Then, a voice rang out cheerfully from the direction of the guest room. "Oh, you're back! I thought your flight was delayed again." Claire turned. Standing in the doorway, wearing a crisp blouse and holding a cup of herbal tea, was Eleanor Morgan, David's mother. She looked completely at ease, as if she were the lady of the house. David shifted behind Claire, his voice suddenly sheepish. "Mom decided to stay for a bit, just while the contractors are redoing her bathroom. You know, the plumbing issue? I told you. Well, maybe I forgot to tell you. It's just temporary." Claire blinked again, her jaw somewhere near the floor. "How long has she been here?" Eleanor answered before David could. 4 days. I didn't want to intrude, but since the house was empty and you insisted on giving me the key before your wedding, I thought, why not?" Claire looked at David. He was already scratching the back of his head, avoiding her eyes. She forced a smile. Right, temporary. That evening, over dinner, which Eleanor prepared without asking, Claire sat at her own dining table while David nodded along to his mother's stories about bridge tournaments and yoga classes. Claire didn't say much. She kept spooning mashed potatoes onto her plate and smiled through the awkwardness. Eleanor dominated the conversation. She asked about their honeymoon, then interrupted halfway through to critique how much sun Claire had gotten. She reminded David not to drink cold water with dinner. She even mentioned, offhandedly, that the guest bathroom towels were too thin, so she replaced them with some real cotton ones from her storage. Claire was quiet. After dinner, she tried to take a shower, but the guest room had now officially become Eleanor's room. Her toiletries were lined up by color in the cabinet. The lavender scent was stronger in there. Claire ended up brushing her teeth in the kitchen sink. That night, lying in bed beside David, she whispered, "So how long is a bit?" David didn't answer right away. Then finally, she said 2 weeks, maybe 3, just until the bathroom's done. Claire turned to face the ceiling. "And you forgot to mention it?" He sighed. "She's my mom. I didn't think it'd be a big deal." Claire didn't argue. She didn't sigh dramatically. She didn't even frown. She simply said, "Okay." Then she rolled over and turned off the lamp. But she didn't fall asleep for a long time. The next morning, Eleanor was already up before them, cooking oatmeal with raisins and setting out herbal vitamins beside their coffee cups. She complimented Claire's robe, though pink isn't really your color, dear, and asked David if he still wanted her to call the tailor about fixing his wedding tux. Claire laughed softly to herself, a sound dry and small. David glanced at her. "What's funny?" She shook her head. "Nothing. Just thinking how some guests make themselves at home." Eleanor smiled as she poured coffee. "Oh, honey, I'm not a guest. I'm family." Claire stared into her cup, the black swirl reflecting her face. She said nothing, but for the first time in her life, she wished she were still in Santorini. And deep down she knew this wasn't going to be just 2 weeks. Not even close. The first time Eleanor criticized Claire's cooking, it was over something simple, grilled chicken with lemon and herbs. Claire placed the plates on the table with a quiet pride. She'd rushed home from work to make something fresh, something warm. but Eleanor barely touched it before she smiled and said, "It's nice. Though I've always thought lemon dries the meat. Have you ever tried poaching with rosemary? David always loved that as a boy." Claire glanced at David, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he just gave a weak smile and stabbed at a piece of broccoli. The second time it happened, it was spaghetti, a simple dinner on a Thursday. Eleanor had entered the kitchen halfway through and gasped, as if Claire had set fire to the stove. "Pasta?" she said. "At this hour?" Claire blinked. "It's 6:30. Eleanor put a hand over her heart like Claire had cursed. "David has delicate digestion. I told you that. Didn't I, sweetheart? Remember what happened that one time after lasagna night?" David chuckled nervously, avoiding both their eyes. "Yeah, it's probably fine." But he pushed the plate away after a few bites. Claire didn't eat much either. By the end of the week, Eleanor had taken to hovering in the kitchen as Claire cooked, peeking into pots, stirring without being asked, turning down the heat like the stove was her own. She never raised her voice. She never outright insulted. But her presence filled every space like thick fog, quiet, dense, inescapable. Even Saturday mornings weren't safe anymore. Claire used to cherish them. Sunlight through the windows, her robe, her tea, a book she never finished. But now she'd wake to the sound of Eleanor humming in the living room while rearranging furniture. One morning, Claire found the armchair turned toward the window and all the framed photos realigned. David's college graduation front and center, their wedding picture placed just slightly to the side. "It's better for energy flow," Eleanor said casually, dusting the frame. "I read a book on feng shui." Claire didn't respond. She simply picked up her mug and walked back into the kitchen, where even the fridge magnets had been rearranged. On Monday, things took a sharper turn. Claire was in the middle of a Zoom call. Her manager had just asked her to lead the next client pitch, when Eleanor knocked, opened the door anyway, and said, "Darling, can you come help me move the garden pots? They're too heavy for me." Claire muted herself. "I'm in a meeting." Eleanor frowned, as if that were news. "Again? You're always in meetings. I was just saying to David last night, it might be healthier if you took a break from all this work. Focus on being a proper wife while you're still young." Claire's jaw tightened. "I like my job." Eleanor gave a sympathetic smile. "Of course, but jobs come and go. A home? That's forever." Then she left the room as if she hadn't just stepped on something sacred. Claire stared at her screen. The meeting had moved on. No one noticed she was gone. That night, Claire mentioned it to David. They were brushing their teeth in silence, side by side, when she said, "Your mother thinks I should quit my job." David spat out toothpaste and looked at her in the mirror. "She said that?" "She said I should focus on being a proper wife, whatever that means." He laughed, but it wasn't mean. It was just awkward, like someone trying to shake off an insult with a shrug. "She doesn't mean it that way. You know how she is." Claire wiped her mouth with a towel. "Do I? She's just used to being involved. She's trying to help." "Is she?" Claire asked softly, folding the towel. "Because it doesn't feel like help." David didn't answer. He looked down at the sink and turned off the light. By the end of the month, it felt like every decision, small or big, had 3 votes: Claire's, David's, and Eleanor's. But somehow, Eleanor always got the final word. When Claire wanted to book a weekend getaway for just her and David, Eleanor reminded them of a family friend's wedding they couldn't possibly miss. When Claire bought new sheets in a color she liked, Eleanor returned them, saying they clashed with the theme of the house. One afternoon, Claire came home early to find Eleanor sitting with the neighbors on the front porch, sipping iced tea and discussing how Claire's always working late and how hard it must be for David to come home to an empty house. Claire stood in the doorway, frozen. Eleanor turned and smiled. "Speak of the devil! We were just talking about you." Claire didn't smile back. She wanted to scream. She wanted to slam the door and say something cold. But instead, she stepped inside, set her bag down, and went to the bathroom. She stared at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked tired, not angry, just vanishing. And that somehow felt worse. That night, she didn't cook. She ordered takeout. David didn't ask why. And Eleanor? She sniffed at the food and said, "I suppose this is fine for tonight." Claire nodded. She sat down and ate slowly, methodically. In her head, she made a list. of all the things she used to choose on her own, of all the things she was starting to lose, and of how much longer she could keep pretending this was okay. At first, Claire didn't even notice David was coming home later. It started with 30 minutes, then an hour, then almost 2. Some nights he'd text, stuck in traffic. Other nights he wouldn't say anything at all. She would hear his key in the door just before 10, shoulders slumped, necktie loosened. He always looked surprised to find her still awake. "I thought you'd be asleep," he'd mumble, kissing her cheek in passing. "I was waiting." She'd answer. He never asked why. Meanwhile, Eleanor had filled the space he left behind, completely and unapologetically. It was Eleanor who now decided what they ate for dinner. Tuesday became salmon night. Thursday was soup and salad. Pasta, Claire's favorite, was deemed too heavy for weekday evenings. "I read an article," Eleanor said one night while spooning lentil soup into bowls, "about how complex carbs affect emotional regulation. Isn't that interesting, Claire?" Claire just stirred the soup silently. It tasted like salt water in silence. When she suggested a change, maybe steak on Friday, Eleanor tutted softly. "That's red meat, dear. We're not cavemen." David had smiled at that. Not unkindly, just the way someone does when they're used to the conversation going a certain way. Weekends became harder. Claire used to imagine long, lazy mornings with David. Pancakes, coffee on the balcony, grocery shopping, and late lunches. Instead, each Saturday morning was punctuated by Eleanor's voice through the bedroom door. "David, we need to leave by 10 if we're going to make the art auction." "David, remember, we promised to visit Aunt Peggy." "David, I need help moving those flower pots before the rain." He went. Always. Claire stopped asking where they were going. She just stayed behind and did laundry, or wandered the aisles of a bookstore, or sat in the park with her coffee, watching strangers live lives that looked more like the one she thought she'd have. One Saturday afternoon, while folding clothes in the bedroom, she found one of David's old t-shirts, the one he used to wear when they binge-watched TV shows on Sunday nights. She held it for a long time, breathing in the faint, fading scent of him. She couldn't remember the last time they'd done that. Conversations with David grew shorter, more logistical than personal. When she tried to talk about how she missed him, about how things felt off, he always seemed too tired or too distracted. "She just needs help, Claire," he said one night, rubbing his temples. "She's alone. It's not permanent." But it was starting to feel permanent. More than once, Claire walked into the living room to find Eleanor sitting beside David on the couch, flipping through photo albums. She would pat his knee, tell him stories from his childhood, how he used to line up his toy cars, how he always knew what he wanted. Then she'd glance at Claire and say something like, "Of course, back then he didn't need to ask anyone for permission." It wasn't direct. It was never direct. But Claire felt the sharpness of every word, like paper cuts, invisible, but painful. She started nodding through everything. When Eleanor booked a dinner reservation without asking, Claire nodded. When Eleanor said she'd invited guests over because David loves company, Claire nodded. When David forgot their anniversary until the morning of, and Eleanor said, "He's just busy, dear," Claire nodded again. Eventually, she stopped correcting people when they mispronounced her last name. She stopped wearing her favorite perfume because Eleanor said it gave her headaches. She stopped buying peonies because Eleanor preferred orchids. Claire, the girl who once danced barefoot in the rain, who painted her nails midnight blue just because she liked the shade, who made playlists for road trips and sang off-key, began to vanish. And no one seemed to notice. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror and studied her face. It looked pale, tired. Faint traces of the woman she used to be flickered in her eyes, but they were distant, like an old photograph taken just before someone blinked. David came home late that night. She heard his keys, his sigh, the shuffle of his shoes. She didn't greet him. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, listening to the silence between them stretch like an invisible wall. "I brought dinner," he said, setting down a takeout bag. "Already ate," Claire replied, though she hadn't. "Oh." He opened the container anyway. Thai food. He hated Thai food. But Eleanor loved it. Claire stared at her hands. They were folded neatly in front of her, like they were waiting for instructions. "Claire," David said gently, "are you okay?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine. He nodded. Good. Just checking. Then he started eating, scrolling on his phone. Claire watched him for a while. The man she married. The man who once made pancakes in the shape of hearts and promised her they'd always protect each other's dreams. She couldn't remember the last time he looked at her like she was the person he chose. The next morning, she woke up before both of them and sat alone on the balcony with a blanket and a cup of coffee. The sunrise was soft, quiet, like it was apologizing for something. And for the first time, Claire whispered out loud, "I don't know who I'm becoming." No one answered. But the silence? It sounded a lot like agreement. Claire had always believed that home was the one place where she could breathe fully. A soft sanctuary. A space where she didn't need to perform. But lately, their house no longer felt like that. The walls still looked the same, the kitchen still smelled of rosemary and coffee, but something had shifted. Something invisible. Something suffocating. So she decided to reclaim it, one corner at a time. It started with a rug, a deep blue Persian-style rug that she fell in love with the moment she saw it at the boutique downtown. It was bold, elegant, nothing like the beige and cream aesthetic Eleanor had curated across the entire house. Claire imagined placing it in the living room, right under the coffee table, the way she used to imagine placing pictures of her and David along the staircase wall before Eleanor filled it with portraits from his childhood. She brought the rug home herself, unrolled it carefully, and stood there smiling. For the first time in weeks, something in the house felt like her. When Eleanor came home and saw it, she stopped mid-step. "Oh," she said, lips tightening. "That's quite vibrant." Claire remained calm. "It's my house. I wanted a change." Eleanor didn't argue. She just smiled thinly and walked to the kitchen. Claire could feel the disapproval radiating from her like heat from a stove. The next morning, the rug was gone, folded neatly, tucked in the laundry room, without a word. Claire stared at it in disbelief. Her fingers curled around the doorframe. At breakfast, she asked, "Did you move the rug?" Eleanor looked up from her toast. "It wasn't centered. I didn't want anyone to trip. I liked it where it was." "I know, dear," Eleanor said with an apologetic tone that wasn't really apologetic. "But we all live here. Harmony is important." Claire waited for David to say something. He didn't. That night, she tried again. She brought up the idea of having her friends over. Just a few people. Wine, cheese, maybe board games. Something small, something warm. Something she needed. David hesitated. "I guess, but let's not go overboard. Mom's not really into entertaining, and she might get tired. She's not hosting, I am." Still, when Saturday came, Claire baked, arranged flowers, set out candles. Her friends arrived around 6, each of them bringing something, a bottle of wine, a pie, laughter. Claire was just starting to relax, to feel like herself again, when Eleanor emerged from the hallway dressed in a robe and a weary expression. "Oh," she said, clearly surprised. "I didn't know we were having guests." Claire looked up. "It was on the fridge calendar. I wrote it down last week." Eleanor glanced at the table, the food, the people. "I just thought we agreed to have a quiet weekend." David stood awkwardly in the kitchen, not speaking. Claire's friend Jenna whispered, "Is that your mother-in-law?" Claire nodded without smiling. Eleanor lingered for a few minutes before walking back to her room, but the mood had shifted. Claire could feel the stiffness in the air. Her guests still chatted, still ate, but they glanced down the hallway occasionally, like someone might come back and shush them. By 9, everyone had left. Claire cleaned in silence. David leaned on the doorway and said, "It was fine. Just maybe next time give her a heads up." Claire turned slowly. "I did." David rubbed his forehead. "Okay, but let's not fight. It's not worth the drama." Claire laughed, soft and sharp. "No, of course not. My life's not worth the drama." She didn't wait for a reply. She went upstairs and sat on the floor of the guest room, her old office, before Eleanor took it over, and opened a notebook. She stared at the blank page, then wrote the date in the corner. She moved the rug. Again. David didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't want to pick a side. She closed the journal and hid it behind a stack of old books in her closet. The next day, Eleanor placed a pot of artificial orchids on the coffee table. Claire didn't say anything, but that night she wrote, "The orchids are fake, but she waters them anyway, just to look busy." Every night became a new entry. Nothing dramatic, nothing long, just details, small, quiet records of a woman slowly vanishing inside her own home. Her handwriting grew tighter, her words more direct. One entry read, "He's starting to laugh more at her jokes than mine." Another said, "I walked into the kitchen and forgot why. Maybe I was just looking for myself." The notebook became her only honest space, a place where she could say what no one wanted to hear, that she was still here, still watching, still trying. The house no longer looked like hers. The choices were no longer hers. But her thoughts were, and for now, that was something. Barely. The Sunday brunch was meant to be simple. Claire had woken early, peeled potatoes, squeezed oranges by hand, and baked a quiche Lorraine from her grandmother's old recipe book. She even polished the silverware. She told herself it would be worth it. David's cousins were visiting, and Eleanor wanted everything just right. Claire had tried to make it her own too. Cut flowers from the garden, set a soft jazz playlist, and laid out linen napkins embroidered with her initials. Small touches of who she was, in a house that increasingly no longer reflected her. Eleanor, of course, arrived late to the table, but first to speak. "You know," she began as she stirred sugar into her coffee, "I've been thinking about that little house of yours, Claire. The one from your childhood." Claire looked up from her plate, already alert. "My father's house?" "Yes, dear, that one. I was talking with Mr. Coffey Caldwell from the country club last week. He mentioned how the neighborhood's being revitalized, which usually means one thing, time to sell. A house like that is sweet, but really, it's rather provincial, don't you think?" David didn't say anything. He was cutting into his bacon, acting as if Eleanor were reading the weather report. Claire straightened in her seat. "It's not just a house. It's my memory. It's all I have left from my father." Eleanor smiled, as if Claire had missed the point. "Of course, darling. I just mean that as your legacy grows, your marriage, your future family, you might want to invest in something that better reflects that. Something grander, something fitting." "Something fitting for who?" Claire hadn't meant to raise her voice, but it was too late. The table had gone quiet. One of the cousins coughed awkwardly. Eleanor responded smoothly, never breaking her perfect poise. "For all of us. The Morgans are a respected family, after all." Claire smiled tightly and folded her napkin. "Of course." She stayed silent the rest of the meal, only speaking when spoken to. She refilled glasses, passed the jam, cleared the plates. She watched David laugh with his cousins, watched Eleanor charm them all with her soft voice and sharper opinions. It was all so curated, like a play where everyone had memorized their lines, except Claire, who had no script. That night, once the guests had gone and Eleanor had retreated to her evening bath ritual, Claire walked into the laundry room with a basket of folded towels. She stood there for a long time. The machine hummed softly. A faint smell of detergent lingered in the air, and then, without warning, her knees gave in. She sat on the cold tile floor, still holding the basket. She cried. Not the kind of dramatic sobbing people see in films, but a quiet, breathless sort of crying. The kind that comes when you realize you're grieving something still alive. Her fingers gripped the edge of the laundry basket like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. It wasn't just the house. It was everything. It was the feeling of not being heard, of being outvoted in her own marriage, of her history being treated like clutter, of David's silence, again and again, becoming complicity. She thought of her father, his warm voice, the way he used to whistle while watering the plants outside the porch. She thought of their evenings eating cereal for dinner because neither of them wanted to cook. She thought of the creaky stair, the mustard-colored curtains, the bookshelf that leaned like it was tired but still stood anyway. That house was never fancy, but it was full of love, and now Eleanor wanted to erase it. Claire pressed her palms to her eyes until her tears stopped. Later, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote. She called it provincial. I call it home, and for the first time, I'm afraid I'll lose both. She looked at the words until the ink dried. Then she closed the notebook, stood up, and poured herself a glass of water. The moonlight slid across the floor tiles like silver thread. Something inside her was changing, cracking. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew. The next time Eleanor crossed the line, Claire wouldn't just smile politely. She would speak, in full, in her own language, even if no one else understood. The morning after the brunch, Claire brewed coffee earlier than usual. The sun had barely touched the kitchen tiles, and the silence in the house was heavier than any silence she had ever known. She sat at the dining table, fingers curled around the warm mug, waiting. When David finally came downstairs, still in his t-shirt and half asleep, she didn't smile. She pushed the second mug toward him, and he sat down across from her with a faint, distracted yawn. She waited until he took the first sip. Then quietly she said, "Why didn't you say anything yesterday?" David blinked. "What do you mean?" "When your mother suggested I sell my father's house." Her voice was calm, careful, but her eyes didn't waver. "You just kept eating, like she wasn't talking about erasing the last piece of my life before this one." David sighed. "Claire, she didn't mean it that way. But she said it that way, and you let her." She didn't yell. She didn't accuse, but the weight in her tone was unmistakable. "She doesn't get to decide what I do with my father's house. That place is mine." David leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly defensive. "This is exactly what I mean. You read into things." She was trying to help. "No," Claire said, still steady. "She was trying to control, like she always does. Like moving into this house and rearranging everything, like turning our life into hers." He frowned. "She's staying with us temporarily. It's been over 5 months." "She's my mother, Claire. What do you expect me to do? Kick her out?" "I expect you to remember this is my house," she said, voice low, controlled, but trembling underneath. "My father left it to me. It was the only thing he could give me, and now I live in it like I'm a guest." David stared at her. "It's our house. This is our marriage, Claire. It's not just about what's yours." She felt something inside her tilt. "But it is about me," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "because I'm the one disappearing in it." David stood abruptly, grabbing his coffee mug, walking to the sink. "You're overthinking, again. It's not that serious." Claire stood too, but slower. "To you, maybe it's not." He didn't answer. She didn't wait. That night, Claire didn't sleep in their bedroom. She gathered a pillow and one of the thinner blankets from the linen closet and walked down the hallway to what used to be her father's study. The room still smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish, though Eleanor had turned it into a storage space for rarely used china and decorative baskets. Claire didn't care. She placed the pillow on the worn armchair by the window, pulled the blanket over her legs, and closed her eyes. The chair creaked a little, like it remembered her father's weight. The wind whispered against the window pane, like it remembered the man who used to hum songs from the 80s as he read old books here. Claire didn't cry this time. She just breathed. The next morning, David found her sitting on the floor with her journal open, writing silently. He stood in the doorway for a few seconds before saying, "You're being dramatic." Claire didn't look up. "No, I'm being quiet. That's different." He exhaled through his nose, frustrated. "So you're just going to hide out in here now?" "I'm not hiding," she replied. "I'm resting. There's a difference." He didn't know what to say. After a long pause, he turned and walked away. That evening, Eleanor noticed the change. She glanced into the study and saw the pillow, the blanket, the soft trail of Claire's perfume still lingering. At dinner, she asked, "You're not sleeping in your bedroom anymore?" Claire looked her in the eye and replied, "I needed air." Eleanor's smile was polite. "Oh." No one said anything after that. Claire returned to the study every night after. She didn't sleep well, but she felt safer. Her thoughts had more space. She wrote more, sometimes just a line or two, sometimes nothing but a question. How much can you shrink before no one sees you at all? When does marriage stop being ours and start becoming mine versus theirs? On the 4th night, she found an old photo in the desk drawer, her father and her, sitting on the porch with cups of ice cream. She wasn't smiling in the picture. She was looking at him. He was mid-laugh. She placed the photo on the desk and stared at it for a long time. Then, gently, she whispered, "If you were here, would you tell me to leave?" She wasn't sure what answer she wanted, but she knew one thing. The study felt more like home now than her marriage ever had in months. And that thought stayed with her, quietly, persistently, like a question no one else could answer. Not even David. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Claire came home early from work. Rain tapped softly against the windows, the kind that never quite turns into a storm, but lingers with a kind of quiet warning. She opened the front door, shook the water from her umbrella, and walked through the hallway. Still dim, still lined with Eleanor's floral runners. She felt tired but calm. All she wanted was her space, her chair, her father's study. But the moment she stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. The room was different. The armchair had been moved, the blanket folded and stuffed into a drawer. Her father's photo was gone. In its place, a glass vase filled with artificial peonies, a stack of neutral-colored decor books, and a diffuser that hissed out the lavender scent Claire had come to hate. The desk was cleared. Her journal, missing. Claire stood perfectly still. Footsteps behind her broke the silence. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, holding a roll of wallpaper samples and wearing her usual well-meaning smile. "I was going to surprise you," she said cheerfully. "This room had such potential, don't you think? A reading nook, maybe, or a guest tea room. You hardly use it anyway." Claire turned slowly, her voice low. "Where's the photo?" Eleanor blinked. "What photo?" "My father's. The one on the desk." "Oh, that old thing? I tucked it into the side drawer for now. It didn't really match the aesthetic I had in mind." Claire nodded once. She didn't yell. She didn't even raise her voice. She stepped into the room fully, looked around one last time at the transformation, sterile, colorless, lifeless, and then turned to face Eleanor. "Pack your things." The words were soft, almost too soft. Eleanor laughed. "Sorry?" Claire's eyes didn't move. "Pack your things." There was a pause, a moment that hovered, unsure where to land. Eleanor's expression shifted. The amusement drained slowly, replaced by confusion, then offense. "Claire, don't be ridiculous." "I'm not," Claire said calmly. "You've overstayed. You've taken over every corner of this house, of my life. I let it happen. That was my mistake. But this," she gestured gently around the study, "this is where it stops." Eleanor's voice hardened. "David won't stand for this." Claire didn't blink. "This isn't about David anymore." She moved to the desk, opened the drawer, and took out the photo. Her father's eyes smiled up at her, even through the glass. She placed it gently back on the desk. Then she looked at Eleanor, this time not as a daughter-in-law, but as the rightful woman of the house. "I want you out. By tomorrow." Eleanor stepped back, lips parted in disbelief. "You don't mean that." Claire's voice was clear, steady, final. "I do." For the first time, Eleanor had no reply. That night, Claire sat in the study again. Blanket over her legs, tea beside her, the rain outside soft and persistent. The photo was back where it belonged. Her journal had been found, tucked under the bed, and she wrote one simple line. "She touched the only part of me that was still untouched. So I finally said no." David came home just after 10. Eleanor met him at the door before Claire could. "She's asked me to leave," she said, shaking her head, sounding more disappointed than angry. "Can you believe that?" David looked at her, then slowly turned toward the study where Claire sat, the door half open. Claire didn't move. She didn't have to. Her silence had already spoken louder than any fight ever could. And for the first time, David didn't rush to defend anyone. He simply stood in the hallway, torn, but no longer blind. Eleanor left quietly the next morning. No dramatic goodbyes, no lingering looks. She rolled her suitcase to the front door without asking for help, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She didn't make eye contact with Claire, who stood in the hallway, arms folded loosely, watching with a calmness that came from a place deeper than anger. David stood beside his mother, jaw tense, eyes clouded. He offered to call a car. She declined. When the taxi pulled into the driveway, Eleanor placed one gloved hand on David's arm and whispered something in his ear. Claire didn't ask what it was. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and just like that, the house fell into a silence that felt unfamiliar. Not unpleasant, just heavy, like a long exhale after holding in too much for too long. David didn't say anything. Neither did Claire. They stood in the foyer for a moment, surrounded by the ghost of a presence that had ruled their lives for too long. Then, without a word, Claire turned and walked to the kitchen. She made herself tea, slowly, deliberately, and carried it to the study. David didn't follow. By evening, they were still circling each other, sharing the same walls but not the same air. The house, stripped of Eleanor's voice and footsteps, felt bigger, emptier. But not in a bad way, just quiet. Claire didn't cook dinner. She didn't ask if David wanted to eat. He came downstairs around 7, heated up leftover pasta, and ate alone in the dining room. Claire sat in the study with a sandwich and her notebook. No music played, no conversation filled the space. But for the first time in years, Claire wasn't adjusting herself to anyone else's comfort. She was simply being. Later that night, David hovered in the doorway of the study. Claire looked up briefly, then returned to her writing. He opened his mouth like he wanted to speak, but the words didn't come. Eventually, he walked away. Claire listened to his footsteps fade, then wrote, "Peace isn't loud. It doesn't cheer when it arrives. It just sits beside you and waits for you to notice." She closed the journal and looked around. The room was hers again, uncluttered, familiar, still holding the scent of old paper and quiet resolve. She didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't a victory. It was something softer, something honest. She had drawn a boundary, and no one had come to clean it up. That night, Claire slept with the door slightly ajar. The silence didn't scare her. It comforted her, because for once, it was hers. The silence between Claire and David lasted for 3 more days. Not angry silence, not cold, not punishing, just space. Like 2 people walking on the edges of the same map, trying to decide if they're still going to meet in the middle. Claire woke up each morning before David, made her own tea, read on the balcony. She didn't ask if he'd be joining. He didn't offer. He came home from work later than usual, ate dinner alone again, watched TV with the volume low. Every evening he glanced toward the study, toward her, but never said much beyond a tired, "Hey," until Friday night. Claire was in the kitchen, slicing apples with slow, deliberate movements. She just poured herself a glass of water when David appeared behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes uncertain. "She called me," he said. Claire didn't look up. "I figured she would." David exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "She asked if I'm happy, Yupine, if I've chosen her or you." Claire paused for a second, then set the knife down gently. She turned to face him. "And what did you say?" David hesitated. "I told her I don't want to choose, that I shouldn't have to." Claire leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "You've already been choosing, David. Every day you stood by and said nothing. You were choosing." He looked down, ashamed. "I didn't mean to. I felt stuck. Between the 2 of you, I kept telling myself it would get better if I kept the peace." She nodded slowly, not unkindly. "There is no peace when only one person is fighting for it. You kept the noise low, sure, but it still chipped away at me." David's voice dropped. "I didn't think you'd ever push back. You always tried to be kind." "I was kind," Claire said quietly. "Kind doesn't mean blind. I kept waiting for you to see me, to step in, to remind her that I mattered too." "I was afraid," he admitted. "That if I upset her, I'd lose her." Claire looked at him for a long time. Her voice softened, but the words were sharp. "You were afraid to lose her, and you never once thought you might lose me." That struck him. His shoulders sank. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper now. "There is no middle, David. Not when someone's drowning. You think you're standing between 2 people. But you've been holding the lifeboat and giving it to the person who's been on shore the whole time." David's lips parted, but no words came. Claire continued, "I didn't ask you to choose between love and loyalty. I asked you to protect what we built, to protect me. You didn't have to turn your back on her. You just had to face me when I needed you." He swallowed. "I know. I see it now. Too late? I hope not." The room fell silent again. David took a careful step forward. "I want to try, to be better. I don't want to lose you." Claire didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. "You don't get to fix everything in one night," she said. "I'm still here. But I'm not the same. I don't know what comes next." He nodded, slowly. "Then start small. Let me try to learn you again. Not the version my mother made up. You." Claire looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in months saw not just her husband, but the man he might still become. She nodded once. "Then start with this. Take down the ugly clock in the hallway, the one she insisted on." David blinked. Then slowly, a sheepish smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Done." Claire didn't laugh, but for the first time in a long while, she almost did. The first thing Claire did on Saturday morning was open all the windows. The house, for the first time in nearly half a year, felt like it could breathe again. The air moved freely, no tension pressing against the walls, no unsaid words trapped between door frames. Just sunlight and wind and possibility. She stood in the doorway of the guest room with a paintbrush in one hand and a can of muted sage green in the other. No announcement, no permission, no discussion. This was hers. David appeared behind her, wearing old jeans and one of his faded college t-shirts. He looked at the paint, then at her. "Need a second brush?" Claire handed it over without a word. He took it and followed her in. They didn't talk much as they worked, just the soft rhythm of brushstrokes on the wall and the occasional shared glance when paint dripped on the floor. David offered to move the dresser. Claire said leave it. It could use new energy too. By afternoon, one wall was finished. The room looked different already. Softer, lighter, real. It didn't feel like Eleanor anymore. It didn't even feel like the guest room. It felt like a beginning. The two of them sat on the tarp-covered floor, legs stretched out, fingers speckled with green. Claire reached into a bag of snacks she'd brought up, tossed David a granola bar. "You ever think about how fast everything happened?" she asked quietly. David leaned his head back against the wall. "Sometimes. Mostly, I think about how slow I was to do anything about it." Claire didn't answer. She peeled the wrapper from her granola and took a bite. His phone buzzed beside him. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, then turned it toward her. "Mom calling." Claire looked at it for a second, then looked back at him. "I'm not ready," she said. David nodded. "Then I won't answer." He let the phone ring out and set it face down on the floor. It was a small moment, but it said more than any apology ever could. Later that evening, they stood together in the kitchen, shoulder to shoulder as they cooked. Claire added chili flakes without asking, and David didn't object. When she reached for her favorite wine glass, the one Eleanor once called too kitschy, David poured her drink in it without hesitation. Dinner was eaten slowly, together. Afterward, Claire walked through the house and began taking down the things that no longer belonged. The stiff, over-framed portraits, the soulless wall hangings, the uncomfortable throw pillows. David helped her. No questions asked. They filled a box labeled storage. Maybe some of it would stay out forever. Maybe some they'd revisit with distance. But for now, they were clearing space, not just in the rooms, but between each other. That night, they lay in bed for the first time in weeks. Same mattress, same blanket, but something was different. Claire didn't feel like she was lying beside a stranger anymore. David turned to her just before sleep. "What do we call the guest room now?" Claire closed her eyes, thinking. "My room," she said softly, "but with space for you too." He smiled into the dark. "Sounds like our marriage." Claire didn't reply, but she reached over, found his hand under the covers, and held it. Not because she had to, but because she finally wanted to again. The house, once a battlefield of silent wars, now hummed with something else entirely. Stillness, balance, and the quiet beginning of something better. Not perfect, not magical, but theirs, rewritten room by room, word by word.